I don't think I don't think I've ever had such a hard act to follow as following Barry's presentation there, because I'm going to, some of it is going to be touching on the same things, but I'm going to try and talk, which can't be put into images actually, about what it's like being an MEP and being, if you like, an elected representative in the European Parliament in the midst of this crisis. And really, I suppose we've had crises in the European Union for going on 10 years now, and I've been an MEP since 2009, and the crises are beginning to feel familiar, but they're connected to each other, and they roll on in a kind of awful structure. You could nearly predict what's going to happen next, and its implications for our politics in many European countries, and whether actually how we may be partially helpless to do anything unless very radical things are done. We've seen 10 years of crisis, and the problems have been made intractable by the gap between our ambitions for a common space and the outcomes of incomplete politics and dynamics between institutions that span national frontiers without subsuming them. So we have a problem with the European Union in terms of that the institutions are not close enough to the people, and Europe is fragmenting, and it's fragmenting because of inequalities within it and outside it. So we have war and chaos in our immediate neighbourhood, and this has led a huge number of human beings to reach for safety on our shores in a wave without precedent since World War II. And that's kind of shocking in itself. And it's the lack of adequate response that has led to the humanitarian crisis. But the crisis has its roots in the much more familiar and long-standing world of states and national leadership, or actually the lack of national leadership, and the Middle Eastern order that took shape through Western intervention after the First World War is just convulsing through Western intervention. So it's a humanitarian crisis with huge numbers of traumatised people risking their lives. We've seen the hundreds that have drowned, the pictures in the newspapers. They're escaping civil war and extremist violence, and they face barriers, linguistic and cultural barriers, and the fears of the host society. So if we look at the absolute figures of refugees that have been reaching Europe, there's actually no reason why, on an EU-wide scale, this should be a migration crisis that Europe is struggling to cope with. How would we describe the situation in Lebanon, a much less prosperous nation, with just about the population of Ireland hosting over 1 million refugees? That was the number estimated to have reached the German territory last year. This was the number to reach the German territory last year after Chancellor Angela Merkel suspended de facto the Dublin asylum system in a move that was principled and right. And she has been paying a political price within her own ranks, and that price is growing. The Dublin system was never fit to deal with a regional emergency of the kind we are facing, and it's been failing for many years, especially since the unravelling of the Arab Spring. And holding the frontline EU countries as hostages to accidents of geography, left alone to cope with the influx, was obviously no solution, and Ms Merkel's action was a moment when the overwhelming force of the facts on the ground was acknowledged with political leadership and a very difficult decision taken. Difficult, that is, when you're surrounded by other leaders who are guided by political expediency and survival. And that situation doesn't show any signs of changing. So the frontline countries were not only trapped by geography, but enfeebled by economic crisis and the cure of bleeding that the doctor ordered, particularly in the case of Greece. So we see all the interconnecting issues there that are making this worse. So there was the continued influx led to a string of unilateral moves by national governments and the erection of border walls that diverted migratory fluxes and pressures elsewhere. Uncoordinated barrier-raising response, not only along EU's external borders, but also within the Schengen area. So some of those actions were in fact illegal, the closing of borders. They caused ruptures within the member states, and they still are. And of course, the political situations in those countries are causing more problems within the treaties, because they're coming close to violating them. The future of a border-free Schengen area is very much uncertain, all the more so due to the latest Paris and Brussels terror attacks that were followed by the declaration of states of emergency and the reintroduction of other border controls. And this, with the reports of attacks on women during New Year's celebrations, also added to the almost palpable atmosphere of moral panic in some countries, if that's what you can call it, as the influx kept a pace during the current year up to the deal struck with Turkey. And we could talk about that deal endlessly and how it's actually not going to work, in my opinion. So this wasn't the first time, by the way, that Fortress Europe struck a Faustian pact to stem the tide. Over a decade ago, before turning on Colonel Gaddafi, we paid his regime to act as the advance guard of the EU's external border and turned a blind eye on the methods used to keep migrants at bay. And how many times in world politics have we expediently, the United States expediently arming nations in the Middle East and then turning on them when something like oil was in play for them. This is down to these types of judgments. So whatever about any judgments of moral equivalence we might be tempted to make or otherwise, the EU country leaders struck a deal with Turkey outside the EU framework, but it's predicated on changes to policies that the European Parliament has a say on. And I have always had the feeling that when deals are struck outside the framework, something always goes wrong in the end, and it has gone wrong. We've registered the reports of extremely serious human rights abuses against migrants by Turkish authorities that reach us from the most reliable sources, and the UN Refugee Agency's disengagement from the exchanges. So we feel that many MEPs feel that we should not grant Mr. Erdogan's Turkey's visa-free status unless all conditions applicable are met. And while on the topic of conditions, we MEPs certainly don't see it as a bargaining chip for a dubious deal. Obviously, the terrible state of developments in our southeastern neighbourhood will remain a root cause of migratory pressure, but the vast majority of those who risk their lives and those of their children at sea are Syrian, followed by Afghan and Iraqi asylum seekers. So the Commission's attempts at reforming our common asylum system may be underwhelming compared to what we need, and yet they look radically unacceptable to many EU governments, to the point of spurring legal challenges in the EU court, and that's the reason they're pretty modest from the start. So we need safe and legal corridors to prevent the perilous journeys and to put human traffickers out of business, and that's another growing issue, is traffickers. How are we going to do this? This is not easy, and it will pay off in the longer term, but we have to appeal to what I always call enlightened self-interest to overcome legitimate fears rather than engage in a race to the bottom between our countries to show how tough we are. As Angelina Jolie aptly put it, she was absolutely right when she says that if your neighbour's house is on fire, you're not safe if you lock your doors. So that's where we are. Coming to the Irish situation with our quota of refugees, every Irish NGO representing migrants was in the Parliament last week. And we were talking about what was going on there. They went to the Commission to ask, why have only a few of those refugees reached our shore? Some of them have, and why have they been not taken in? This is has been a great mystery. Other people may know the answer, but they were told by the Commission, sort of sotto voce, as it were, that there are gatekeeper problems, and the gatekeeper problems are with the Department of Justice here. So we don't know what that means, but it was quite disturbing, and the fact that all of them were in the European Parliament talking to us was actually important. So that's our situation in Ireland. we have to grasp that as well, and what does it mean, gatekeeper problems. I suppose we haven't had a government for quite a long time, but that isn't an excuse. And I don't know if we're expressing any value system. I haven't heard a value about this being expressed by Enda Kenny, for instance, or anybody else. And we need a debate about it. We need to talk about it the way they are doing in other European countries, not always in a way that we would like, because of course part of the problem is the unrest within Europe, within those countries, which we have partly brought about by austerity programs. I mean, Greece is in, and of course there is the plan B to the Turkey deal. There is a plan B if it doesn't, which is to give Greece funds to actually deal with refugees. But at the same time, we've pummeled them into the ground with an economic deal that is completely crazy and that can never work. So, and then other countries are in turmoil. Brussels and Belgium and France, for a start. There's strikes everywhere because, and what's happening is that the far right are getting more and more power in these countries, and they are the ones that largely speaking, don't want the refugees. So it's a complex problem because it has to be dealt with in the countries where the refugees are coming from, and it has to be dealt with within Europe. And sometimes things happen. I mean, leadership has been shown by Angela Merkel. We need more of that. And sometimes things happen that force the right thing to be done. But I wouldn't bet on it at this stage because all these issues are interlinked. And Angela Merkel she did take a leadership role in this, but she's under pressure in German politics now. So where do you go from there? But as I said, the Parliament does have a role. We have frozen the visa application. We're not going to deal with it anymore until Turkey Turkey changes some of the acquis that they have to reach before they get it, and we have refused to go any further. So I don't know what will happen there, but we are elected representatives and we can't be overridden on that. So we'll wait to see what happens. And just to say, it was interesting what Barry was saying there. You see, for all the stories of human rights abuses we hear, that place in Turkey, the paediatric clinic, was taking in everybody there. So it's a complicated picture. But I feel as a politician, I was thinking of listening to Barry. I was listening to him there, that I'm not sure that it's easy for us to feel we're actually doing anything. At least you can feel at the end of the day that you have concrete evidence that you're doing something. And very often we feel completely helpless, to actually change the situation as elected representatives. And I kind of envy you in a way, and other people that work in that area, that you have a feeling of being able to do something. But I suppose it's just something else that we do if we get a chance. Thank you very much.